Yeah, and welcome everybody to the March 23rd meeting of the Administrative Committee of Moscow City Council. To my right is Jim Boland, to my left is John Weber, and to his left is City Supervisor Gary Riedner, and I'm Dan Karskalen. First thing on the agenda is approval of the February 23rd and March 9th minutes. I thought we already approved the February 23rd minutes at the last meeting. I know Public Works didn't, but we did.
Yeah, they should have been approved, Steph, at the last meeting.
Yeah, I just got it wrong.
Yeah.
Okay,
Public Works.
but if you guys are okay with the March 9th minutes?
I would move to approve the March
Good
9
with
minutes.
them?
Yes.
All right. We'll consider those minutes approved. Next up is a proposed amendment of Title 4, Chapter 2, Chapter 6, Chapter 11, and Chapter 12 of Moscow City Code regarding accessory dwelling units. And Mike Ray is going to present this mouthful. It's been a long time coming.
Thanks, gentlemen. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So just wanted to brief the committee on a upcoming code amendment. This is going to be heading to City Council on April 6th, which is 2 weeks from now. And it's regarding accessory dwelling units and amending some portions of the zoning code in order to do that. And before we started, I just wanted to run through exactly what accessory dwelling units are. And they're separate additional living unit that's incidental or accessory to a principal dwelling unit on a lot. Generally small in scale, could be a studio or one bedroom type unit. Really doesn't change the overall character of the neighborhood because it's not necessarily another dwelling unit. It's included somewhere on the property, incorporated within a single family dwelling unit. It's either within principal structure or detached structure. So it can be detached, maybe above a garage, or could be attached to a principal structure, being a single-family dwelling, or within a single-family dwelling. So it could be, for instance, like the basement of a house. Owner occupancy upon the property. So owners typically required to reside there, and it could be in the principal structure or the accessory dwelling unit, whichever one they wanted. Generally, they're called granny flats, mother-in-law units, or accessory apartments in other areas. I just wanted to go through why some communities allow accessory dwelling units. It's to create new housing while preserving existing character of the neighborhood. Also allows efficient use of the existing housing stock and public infrastructure. We're not extending roads out of town to build more housing units. We're using the existing infrastructure in order to be able to do that. Also provides affordable housing opportunities because they're generally limited in scale and size. Provides smaller household opportunities because of that as well. It also provides a means for residents that maybe want to stay in their homes, like family members that are elderly, or maybe it's family members that care for the elderly or disabled while providing independent living opportunities. So we first introduced accessory dwelling units in the 2012 Citizen Survey. Planning and Zoning Commission had asked two questions. The first one, would respondents support accessory dwelling unit in their neighborhood? We had provided some background information about what ADUs were, asked that question, and we've got overall strong responses out of that question on that citizen survey. So 63% of respondents said they would either agree or strongly agree with that statement. We only had about 17% of people either strongly disagree or disagree, and then the fair number of people were neutral on that. And then asked, would respondent likely add an accessory dwelling unit to the property? The results came back that not a whole lot of people were interested in doing that at that point in time. So they'd support them in their neighborhood, but at this point, not really interested in adding one. We had 47% disagree with that, 26%, which is a high number of neutral, and so that's kind of an indicator that maybe at some point in the future they'd like to add, maybe change their minds, and something they maybe look into one at that point. So from there, we had taken a look at 7 cities and reviewed their accessory dwelling unit regulations. We looked at Missoula, Coeur d'Alene, Boise, Spokane, Portland, Seattle, and Bozeman. And there were some common themes across all those communities. Similar purpose statements like we had just ran through for creating ADUs or allowing them within the community. a lot of common consideration across the board. It was widely varied about where they were allowed. Predominantly residential zones. Some required conditional use permits, but not very many of them. There was mainly only one community that did. The rest of them allowed it by right within, the zones that they allowed it. Scale, limited for the majority of the ones that we had looked at. Usually it was 600 square feet in size. Height restrictions, and this usually only applies to detached structures. It kind of varied from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It was pretty common for the parking to add one additional off-street parking space in all the regulations, and so that's on top of what's required for the single-family dwelling. Owner occupancy was required most of the time, so the owner living within the principal structure or the accessory dwelling unit. And then there's occupancy limits. Some of them had limited the number of individuals to occupy the ADU to 2. Others just restricted it to the definition of family within their zoning code. And then some regulated the entrance of the ADU, so the front entrance not being allowed to face the principal street or only having one entrance face the principal street. And then there was just a number of other provisions that varied from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So after we had researched how other jurisdictions permit ADUs, the Planning and Zoning Commission conducted the first open house, which was on January 22nd. Included within the open house was a survey at the end to gather some data from respondents that showed up for the open house. We also had that same survey online for 3 weeks after the open house on the project website, which we had developed going through the accessory dwelling unit project. And we had about 28 respondents, whether it be people that had filled out the survey at the open house or online. So then Planning and Zoning Commission conducted a second open house, and this included a lot of the design elements. We wanted to gather input on that. And that was on April 2nd, 2014. Also included the survey, so this was the same format. We also posted it online. After about 3-4 weeks that it was posted online, we had received all that data back, taken a look at it, and it was severely compromised by a biased party. Somebody had flooded the survey results, and it was, blatant that somebody had done that. And so from there, the Commission had decided in October of 2014 to send out a random sample mailed survey to residents throughout Moscow. Chose 342 addresses. There was a 23% response rate, which equated to 78 completed surveys, 9 of which were undeliverable. We also included the same 2 questions that showed up in the 2012 citizen survey as well as the January open house, just for comparison. And they ended up coming back similar, almost identical to the 2012 citizen survey in support of allowing accessory dwelling units within neighborhoods throughout Moscow. Also contained questions about allowing ADUs, usage of ADUs if permitted. We had some other standards in there, as well as occupancy, ownership information as well. We divided that up into aggregate results, R1, R2, as well as R3 and R4. And the public input summary is attached to your packet today. We'll also provide that for the council meeting on April 6th. Gets us to the draft ordinance. Proposing right now, under the current proposed ordinance, that it be allowed, or accessory dwelling units be allowed under all residential zoning districts. So that's ag, forest, farm, ranch, suburban residential, and R1 through R4. And we'd be inserting accessory uses under accessory uses and structures, accessory dwelling units subject to the specific use standards of this code. Within R1, R2, and R3, we would eliminate accessory living quarters serving as a guest house or domestic servant quarters, because really, with the addition of accessory dwelling units, there wouldn't be a need for the guest houses anymore underneath the current code. And they're a conditional use permit within those zones. We really don't have any of them on record as going through that process. There may be a couple of them out there, and those would just be non-conforming, or they could potentially convert them to accessory dwelling units. Looking at accessory building setbacks, in order to achieve a 5-foot rear yard setback, accessory structures have to meet a certain building height requirement. and those are for buildings greater than 200 square feet in size within that rear yard area. Proposing to change the max top plate height from 10 feet to 14 feet there, and that's in order to just, if, say, that you're, for instance, you're looking at adding accessory dwelling unit above a garage, it's just to be able to raise the top plate height and be able to have more livable, usable space in that area without having to enlarge the footprint in order to get the right height in order to be declared livable space, which is 5 feet. And so, depending upon the pitch of your roof, you could come, run into problems with that, and so that's why that's being proposed. We also don't address dormers right now underneath that section, and so we'd be inserting the provision that says dormers allowed to exceed 14 feet as long as they don't exceed 50% of the length of the wall. And so you just don't want a dormer, running the entire length of the wall. It would just be restricted to that 50% of the roof line. Also be going into the definition section and adding a definition of accessory dwelling unit, which is a secondary dwelling unit that is accessory to a single-family dwelling on a single lot containing complete housekeeping facilities and which is added to, created within, or detached from the principal dwelling unit and subject to the specific use standards of this code. And so this is consistent with HUD regulations as well. So we're consistent there. Wouldn't need guest house anymore, like I mentioned before, so we'd be proposing to strike that from the definition section. Also have tourist home, which had shown up in previous or earlier codes, but currently doesn't in any of our zones. So you run into issues with the exclusionary nature of our zoning code. We would just strike tourist home from the definition section since we don't use that. That brings us to the specific use standards. This is the section that would be inserted within Chapter 12 of the code. Goes through applicability and purpose portion, as the majority of the regulations do at the beginning. Then go into the specific standards. We'd start out with a blanket general statement that states that ADUs must meet all district zoning regulations and minimum size for single-family dwellings within their underlying zoning district. And so they'd have to meet those requirements in order to have an accessory dwelling unit. Size would be restricted to 600 square feet or 40% of the gross floor area of the principal dwelling, whichever is less. Limit the occupants to 2. Require owner occupancy for accessory dwelling units, where we'd record a deed restriction against the property, saying that the owner has to reside in the property longer than 6 months out of the year. Provides a safety valve to have the community development director waive this requirement for temporary absences like military absence. If the owner is unable to reside on the property, only one dwelling may be occupied. So, say that occurs, either the accessory dwelling.
So if I got to move into a nursing home and I want to rent my place, I can only rent one or the other of them.
Yeah, owner has to reside on site. And so if you wanted to sell and you were selling to, a purchaser of the property wanted to reside on site and then rent that out, they could reinstate that use, or they just continue on with that use. But if you were to move out, you'd only be able to rent one of them.
This keeps the neighborhood R1 and R2 being R1 and R2.
Correct. It's accessory. It's not a standalone dwelling unit. It's intended to be accessory to a single-family dwelling. So, and lastly, require one off-street parking space for the accessory dwelling unit. So, the Planning and Zoning Commission did conduct a public hearing, and that was on March 11th, 2015, and recommended approval to City Council. And like I mentioned before, this has been scheduled notice for a public hearing at the Council's April 6, 2015 meeting. So certainly be able to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, you two have been intimately involved with this for the last couple of years.
In great detail. It's been, the due diligence has certainly been done on this, and
Absolutely.
And I think we should recommend that we advance this on to Council for the public hearing and potentially approval.
And we've seen it at this committee a couple times, too, with reports.
We have. Yeah, we've been reporting back as we've gone. So.
No, I agree. I think that even though it's something that will not be used a lot, at least the indications are that it won't. It will be used some, and this does help clarify the entire issue. And it also does a good job of protecting the neighborhoods from becoming turning an R1 or an R2 neighborhood into an R3 or an R4 neighborhood, probably an R3. So, yeah, I agree. I think we ought to move it on to the public hearing.
Cleans up a lot of language in the code, too, so
Sure.
looks like we'll be, so let's go ahead and put that on the regular agenda for April 6th.
Public hearing, yes, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Next up is Legacy Crossing Market Assessment and Absorption Study Final Report from Bill Belknap. You haven't seen this as much as the last one, so.
No.
You're not going to see
It's a
much
big-
of it today either.
It's the final one, right?
Good afternoon. Just providing a report to the committee this afternoon on the market analysis that the council authorized late last year for the Legacy Crossing area. So to provide a little bit of background, over the course of the last several years, the city and the University of Idaho and the Urban Renewal Agency have had a desire to assess the potential future development opportunities in Legacy Crossing. There had been a number of community visioning sessions for what the community desired or wished to have for future redevelopment in Legacy Crossing, and we also have gone through kind of a downturn of the recession since the formation of the district in 2008. And so through that time period, we wanted to do a market assessment to assure that what we were anticipating, what we were hoping for in that area was going to be supported in the marketplace. Or if it wasn't going to be supported by the market, what type of assistance or incentives may be necessary to ensure that it could occur. And so that kind of led to the formation of this study. And all the entities wished to desire, the university as a landowner and as an adjacent property owner to the area, the city and the Urban Renewal Agency wish to understand the market support for the different types of development that may see in this area. So this was jointly funded by the university. So the university funded the project, the Moscow Urban Renewal Agency and the city all contributed to the effort. Johnson Economics of Portland, Oregon was the firm that was selected to complete the assessment. And Jerry Johnson, as the principal, was the individual working on the project. We have received this as the preliminary final report that was included in your packet. And we will be having an upcoming workshop with Jerry and of Johnson Economics up here in April once we get that scheduled, in order for them to fully present the findings and answer any questions that the council may have. But I thought I'd run through kind of a brief overview. There's a lot of information in the document, a lot of very individual and very specific market assessments of different components, but I'd run through the kind of the highlights of the study. The study included a number of components within the scope of work. The first was really an evaluation of the condition of the study area, really looking at Legacy Crossing as a district as a whole in the condition and the locational, focus on both the physical and the locational attributes of the area. And also to understand how this area relates to the primary and secondary market areas that in the region. The scope itself included an evaluation of residential, retail, commercial, and office development opportunities in each of those categories, which were done separately. The residential, retail, commercial, and office were the three different segments that were analyzed. Within each of those, we identified, or the study identified the market area, evaluated the effect that current economic and demographic trends in the nation, region, and in the city would impact anticipated future demands in those areas. There was an assessment that was completed of comparable buildings and projects of those individual development types to assess what the market rents were, what the vacancies were in each of those different uses to assess the support in the market. And we also completed a retail spending analysis to evaluate retail leakage. A component of that would be analyzed for retail that could be appropriate in the downtown area, maybe smaller scale, boutique, specialty type retail uses. But we also used the data that came out of that to help support the A Street study project for maybe the larger format, larger scale retailers that may not fit in the downtown area or in Legacy, but also would have a good location behind the mall and the A Street corridor study. So we updated that retail leakage analysis. And ultimately, the project was to identify anticipated short-term and mid-term, long-term market demands for the individual uses to see kind of what demand would be available in the market to support development. Then moved on to evaluation of the redevelopment potential in the district, looking at individual sites and their characteristics. So there was an assessment of current marketing property values and their value ratios, which indicated the likelihood of their ability or their likelihood of redeveloping within the study area. And then there were several redevelopment scenarios that were assessed. So there, at the end of the project, there's an analysis of a number of different development types, whether it's single-story retail use, multi-story residential use, mixed-use projects, straight office projects, in looking at both whether there's podium parking provided, whether there's structured parking that was included in there, and to really look at the feasibility of each of those different product types in this market, given the market rents and the anticipated market depth and market demands. So there were a number of those that were evaluated to test financial viability, and then that led into a residual land value analysis. Many of the elements that go into a project, whether it's the construction cost or reasonable market return, are all kind of fixed numbers, and what's left over is kind of what the project can afford to spend for the land. And those projects that can afford to spend the most for the land are generally viewed as being the highest economic uses of the property. And so that residual land value analysis helps you identify what product types and development forms are going to be more supported in the market and can afford the highest price for the individual land, indicating that there's more profit available in that project type. And then the final summary and recommendations of projects that could be pursued as being viable in both that short-term and mid-term time frame. Generally in the findings of the study, obviously it's no mystery that the employment of Latah County has declined since 2006 and has been somewhat volatile. We've talked in the past about the recession and the university's kind of enrollment decline and kind of its impact on the economy. And so we've had somewhat of a softening of the employment market over the course of the last decade. And that obviously has also been reflected in the University of Idaho's declining enrollment. And so both of those conditions have kind of softened the market since the pre-recession time period. The use types that were analyzed and that appeared to have the strongest market support included upscale urban apartments in the downtown core, as well as small-scale retail and food service spaces and medical office spaces. So the study indicated there was pent-up market demand for upscale downtown living opportunities, that upscale residential opportunities near the campus could also increase marketability of the University of Idaho to students and students' parents, and that the demographic composition of the local population indicates a steadily increasing demand for medical services, and that's been an area, even in this time period of declining enrollment, the medical services sector has continued to grow over the course of the last decade. So apparently we're all getting older and going to need more medical services. The study also indicates that there's support for small-scale commercial developments, smaller-scale retail space and restaurants that would complement the downtown area. The demand anticipated for downtown retail space is not significant. So as we look at the future of development down Legacy Crossing, it's into the 6,000 square feet in the course of the next 3 years. So it's fairly small scale, smaller amount of demand in the retail market for uses that would be suitable in the downtown area. As you looked at the retail leakage analysis, there are several areas where we have the greatest spending leakage: general merchandise store categories, sporting goods, hobby, book, and music stores, clothing, accessories, and electronics and appliance stores. So this table is included in the study that includes the, based upon population and demographics, the anticipated demand, how much spending was happening here locally within the primary and secondary market trade areas, and that opportunity gap of spending that is going somewhere else. And so those that had fairly high, the non-store retailers, a lot of online retail, that's a fairly high number. 96% of what's currently being spent is being lost outside the market area. But again, the general merchandiser has an opportunity gap of 85%, 83% for sporting goods, 77% for clothing and clothing accessories, and then 59% we had actually for the building material, garden equipment stores. So those were the sectors that had the highest retail leakage that, according to the study. There are also several comparable projects from different market areas that were included in the study that were viewed as being feasible mixed-use projects that could be supported based on market rents that were observed during this course of the study. So several of those were shown in the project as being project types that are actually quite consistent with what we have envisioned for a lot of Legacy Crossing and viewed as being supported based upon the market rents that are observed in the market. So that's good. The final product, really looking at the residual land value analysis, and it's really difficult to read this on the screen, but on a per square foot basis, I think this is $16 to $18 to $20 per square foot. As you look at the different mixture, residential ownership, so condos have reviewed as not being likely very feasible, at least at this point in time. There are fairly strict pre-sale requirements. Typically, over 50% of the units have to be pre-sold before financing will be secured on a condo project. And it was anticipated that the market depth was fairly shallow. In a possible combination, or because of its proximity to the University of Idaho campus, the idea of student housing being a component of that may make it difficult to meet those pre-sale requirements. So it was presumed that was probably something that was not going to be likely feasible in this location. As you moved into rental residential projects, as we get into 3-story wood frame townhouse or 3-story wood frame rental units with surface parking, those showed fairly high residual land value analysis, residual land values between $10 and $12 per square foot. And then as you moved into the mixed use category, 3-story mixed use wood frame with surface parking also had fairly high values at the $12 per square foot number. And the highest was single-story low-rise retail, which was pushing nearly $17 a square foot. So a project maybe similar to the Jimmy John's type store development had some of the highest, but the second highest really was that mixed-use project, 3 stories that would anticipated to include 1 floor of retail commercial space and 2 floors of residential. If you looked at some of the others that aren't even shown, many of those had residual land values that were so negative. As you get into the structured parking provision, you would get into fairly significant negative in like the $200 per square foot negative land values. So that certainly is indicating that podium and structured parking is probably not likely in our foreseeable future in the near term. But certainly mixed-use projects with a combination of surface parking would be supported in the market, which is something that's good to know. So as I mentioned, 3-story wood frame. So some of the conclusions, I guess, out of the study were that 3-story wood frame mixed-use projects with surface parking appear to be supportable in the local market. And if you looked at rents on a per square foot basis on residential projects, the highest returning rents are in the downtown area. So the old University Professional building that's in the Turnstone Flats, I think is what the name is, Elizabeth's project, is returning like at $1.43 a square foot. The McConnell project is returning about $1.63 a square foot, and you compare that to rental projects out on A and Baker at 73 cents, 75 cents a square foot. So certainly the smaller scale and the McConnell spaces are in that 250 to 350 square foot unit size, so they're fairly small scale apartments. The Third and Jackson project gets up into the 500 to 650 square feet and still returning at those rates. So it does seem to indicate that there's fairly high support, and at those numbers you can support mid-rise construction, new construction at those rents. So wood-framed, upscale, urban, residential. Now the wood framing is just, obviously as you get away from concrete and steel construction, it's a lower construction cost. That doesn't mean that it cannot have brick veneer and other finishes to the project, but just as a framing in the construction practice is a lower cost construction. Medical office projects also are supportable given the market commands and anticipated increasing market demands for medical services. But the downtown retail and office demand is anticipated to be somewhat limited and of a smaller scale, at least in the short to mid-term. So we should not anticipate that everything on the ground floor in Legacy Crossing is going to be retail use because the market cannot support that. But certainly there are site-specific locations where those uses can be supported of a limited scale, and that the residential certainly could be in that area. So, and that, I guess the last point is there is still significant retail leakage occurring within the area in certain categories, so that does indicate, even for those that may not be suitable for the downtown area or necessarily in Legacy Crossing, there are other locations in the community that I think they could be well received and could be supported within the market. So with that, we'll work on scheduling that workshop here in April so you can have a chance to ask any questions you might have on the study, and we'll get the project wrapped up.
Like how to plug the leaks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bill. You guys got any questions? Guess we'll get to ask him a big time in April.
Yeah, there's bound to be lots of questions about what's going to go on there.
Okay, thanks, Bill.
You bet.
I guess this is mostly just a report.
It's a report for today, and we'll get schedules out, and I know there's going to be some council members out of town for parts of April, so we'll get that worked out.
All right.
We'll make some decisions then.
Always easier to swing a majority when you got less than a quorum.
All right, next on the agenda is the street closures policy that we kicked back last week, and Les McDonald and Tyler Palmer are going to bring that forward. Fixing the other holes that needed plugged.
The other holes that needed plugged. Good afternoon. Well, this is an item that's been before this committee before. As you mentioned, has been to the City Council for consideration. There was some good discussion at that last session, actually both sessions, but at the council session, there were some questions asked about some things that were not addressed, and then some revisions that were requested for this policy, and we were asked to bring it back to this committee to review those changes. So that's why we're here. So, of course, we're talking about the policy and procedure for right-of-way permits for street, alley, and sidewalk closures, neighborhood block parties, and parades, just so the audience knows. And the first area where we made some changes was actually one that did not come from the discussion with the City Council. That actually came out of a newspaper article that was written about the discussion at the City Council and a question that was raised from that. In all of the sections under conditions, so parade closures, neighborhood block parties, construction and community event closures. There are, not on construction, but on the other three, there are provisions in there that talked about how it was limited to 1 day per weekend. After the article and the interpretation that was made of that, we could see that we needed to modify that language a little bit. The intent was not to say this could only occur during the weekend,
right,
but that if it did occur during the weekend, it could only be one of the 2 days of the weekend. So we've modified all three of those sections with the language that's here that now says that weekend events shall be limited to 1 day per weekend. So hopefully that will remove any lack
I was
of
wondering about
clarity
that change because I didn't remember discussing it. And
that's how that came to be, and it was a good catch. So the next item is one that the council did talk about, and it's under Section 4, Part C, under neighborhood block parties. And this is one where we had some options there about allowing block parties without insurance and by providing a release of liability agreement, or allowing block parties with submission of proof of insurance. And the council was of the opinion that we should just keep both of those rather than picking one. So what you see here now is the still somewhat marked up version of what it would look like, but essentially it's that the applicant would provide a signed release of liability and indemnification agreement, or shall submit proof of insurance coverage in the amount of $500,000 for the event, and the City of Moscow to be named as an additional insured on the policy. So we're keeping both options as requested by the council, just cleaned up the language a little bit and added the indemnification agreement portion. The next section is still in Section 4 conditions, but it's in the construction closures. This has to do with the question that was asked during the council meeting about whether or not the city operations with respect to street closures, construction, maintenance, all those type of operational activities would be subject to this policy and would have to obtain permits for every one of those actions. And the thought was that no, that would not be the case. So this language was added that the operations and maintenance activities, including construction of new or reconstruction of existing infrastructure, would be exempt from the permitting process.
yeah, it was implicit before, but we wanted to make sure that we made it explicit.
Right. And again, this is something that, as the agency that does the permitting, we're very cognizant of the requirements of the permitting, and we strive to make sure that we're meeting those requirements without even having to go through a permitting process. And that's something that Tyler's worked on greatly with his crews and will continue to do so with all of those folks out in the field under his observations.
So that's why with the language in this part of the permit, we wanted to emphasize that we're not exempt from the requirements, just from the permitting, because we hold ourselves to the same standard as we'd hold anyone else to. It's just the permitting portion.
The next item was under Section 6 for noncompliance. If you'll recall, there was a commentary here that was highlighted in yellow about the council needing to address how to proceed with this item, the item having to do with the possibility of commercial gain by the applicant through use of public right-of-way. And the council asked that we modify this a bit to include some language to the effect that the events are limited to events open to the general public for which the primary purpose is not for direct commercial gain. So that is now in there by the applicant or the associated parties. We've also added that incidental private commercial activity is allowed. If you recall, the discussion went around if there's a band downtown and they're selling their CDs out on the side, is that okay? Well,
Or somebody's selling hot dogs.
or selling hot dogs, but the idea here is that we want to allow these types of community events, make sure they're open to the public, but they're not being held for the sole purpose of commercial gain. There may be some commercial gain incidental with the event, and this is meant to address that.
Right.
And then I noticed that you
I didn't know there was a different phone number.
thoroughly confused the
Phone number.
issue by putting in a false phone number. That's always good.
Yeah, actually, they're both real phone numbers. It's just a question of where we want the phone to ring. So yes, that is now actually upstairs.
That's what we do when we don't want the calls.
So, and that was it. So those were all the changes that we had proposed based on the conversation with City Council. So, any questions at this point?
You guys got any questions? Think we kind of hit the high points.
Yeah.
I think you did a good job of cleaning everything up, so it's very understandable to everybody that might want to put on a block party. They know exactly what the rules are up front. It's pretty clear and concise. I think that's well done. I think we should forward that for another look at it and get a vote on it this time.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
well, this is a resolution, but it's also changing, well, I guess it's just a resolution, but let's go ahead and put it on regular agenda. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. That's the end of our regular agenda items. Now we're on reports, and the first one is an update on a Moscow Affordable Housing Trust, and Elisa Anderson's going to bring that to us. Nils might as well come forward, too, because he's got lots to do with it. And Nils Peterson's going to join her.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
The council had previously authorized us to provide funding out of the budget that had been in there for quite a while to the Moscow Affordable Housing Trust. And so Gary had assigned me to work with Nils and treat it somewhat like grant funding. And so we just wanted to update you today on the status of what they're doing, and we're going to be releasing a $5,000 check to them for a study that they're having done regarding affordable housing in Moscow. And so I'll let Nils just kind of tell you a little bit about what they anticipate the results, or what they'll be using the results of the survey from.
Great, thanks. So we ended up choosing to contract with Tim Frazier, Geography at U of I. He has been working on the housing study for fair and affordable housing, so he seemed well positioned to work on this task as well. And have tasked him with the biggest kind of question that I want is to learn something about the absorption rate. You just saw a market absorption study for Legacy Crossing, and our interest would be for a particular demographic group that we serve, how many houses might be purchased. If you look at the census, you see that there's 2,900 households that fall into the demographic in the county, but how many of them are interested in buying, how many of them are financially positioned to buy, how many don't own homes already, all of those things subtract down from that pool. Trying to answer the question, how many could you do a year, because that's a question that you would answer that you would take to the bank.
Right.
So that's what we hope to learn from this study, and Tim and graduate students are underway already.
Well, and then, like you said, this already is kind of halfway started with what Fair and Affordable Housing Commission has started. So he's got a little bit of the data there already.
I believe so. That they tend to have more of a focus on the fairness side.
Right.
So this augments, and I'm in regular conversation with the commission, so keeping them in the loop.
So it sounds like we're moving forward in good directions.
And also the trust was awarded, I don't know if there was an article in the newspaper and you had a meeting a few weeks ago. Do you want to kind of share a
I'll
little
tell
bit
you
about that
about
with us?
two other things. One is an award of $350,000
Nice.
for acquisition rehab of single-family homes. The idea is to find a home that is in need of some amount of help, not huge amounts of help, 10 to 15% of its value perhaps, that we can acquire and do the rehab work on using contractors. We're not like Habitat where it's self-help.
Right.
And then resell to somebody in our target demographic group, which means that the final resale price has to be, I'd like it to be $150,000 because anybody in our demographic could probably afford it. I'm thinking we'll have to slide up 170 maybe even, which may only serve part of our demographic, but it may move the project forward.
Right.
So that's kind of at the kickoff. I hesitate to call it a grant because we don't end up with the money. We buy the house with IHFA money, we sell the house, and the money ends up back in Boise. The second activity you may have read about in the paper was the celebration of home ownership community meeting that we held just before spring break. As an activity, it was required by having our CHOTO status. It served as our community input meeting. Excuse me. We had somewhere on the order of 60 people in attendance. Subtract out the known conspirators who were in the room, and I think there were 40 people who came who were interested in finding out about home ownership. And some of those 40 were clearly couples, and some weren't, so somewhere between 20 and 40 households were represented, which from a market study analysis, I go, oh, that's an interesting number. We had a variety of experts from the community to provide two little half-hour workshops is the way it boiled down. We had U of I Extension there to do things on budgeting and credit and finance. Then Team Idaho Real Estate talking about what a realtor does, and Platinum Home Mortgage talking about what a lender does. And Habitat was there. Whitman County CAC, the community action folks over there, are essentially my counterparts. And then I was there, and Bill Belknap was there. Unfortunately, Bill got stood up. Nobody wanted to go to his session. All the other sessions were attended. And I asked folks to write down on a 3x5 card what their next step towards home ownership was. That was my teacherly instinct, to make them write down what their next step in the process was. And was collecting those cards and asking them if they knew. And I got happy faces, and yes, I know. Whether it's I'm applying for Habitat, whose deadline was a few days later, or I realized I could go to see a banker. So I think that we met a number of people's needs for learning about how they could progress towards their own
Somebody
goal.
that didn't think they had a shot, but
Yes, there were people
now they've learned that they could.
who perhaps learned that they could.
So a
Yeah.
successful workshop then.
I think it was very successful, yeah.
So Nels, with this project where you could buy a house that was in need of repair, you could go to, say, a while back ago, we got a letter from Mr. Cox up on Logan Street who has some degradation going on. It was some abandoned houses in his neighborhood. You could find one of those and potentially buy one of those and rehab that so that it's improves the neighborhood and gives somebody in your income demographic a chance at home ownership?
And that kind of idea of neighborhood stabilization and neighborhood revitalization is exactly what the feds hope for this money. Unfortunately, they put a couple of boundaries on it. Because it's federal, there's an environmental assessment. Because of the environmental assessment, they care about lead paint. The easiest way to avoid lead paint is 1978 or newer house. I mean, then it's, by law, there's no lead paint being used. So I checked with the assessor's office. I asked for a list of every single-family house in the city, and I wanted the age, or the year built, and the assessed value. And 40% of the housing stock is 78 or newer. Then I took that and I filtered it for anything below, and the first time I did it, and I want to go back and do it again, I did it between 100 and 150,000. I picked 100 to cut out any trailer or anything that might have still struck in there, and 150 figuring he's always low. Right, yeah. By something. We don't know exactly how much, but kind of consistently low. There are 54 structures in town that fit those criteria. Nobody says that they're beat up. Nobody says that their owner wants to sell them. They're just 54 objects out there, which is the kind of needle in the haystack that we're trying to find.
And now it's just a matter of reassessing those.
Right. So my marketing plug, using your TV time, is I'm looking for, selfless, I'm looking to buy houses that sort of fit in that criteria. 78 or newer, need some work, and will sell in the under $170,000 price range.
So as this works, you say you got $350,000 to do this. Is it something that, you say all the money goes back to Boise, but if you could you keep moving forward? Say you got 90 of them, you could potentially do.
If we show good work in this year, we can reapply. I asked for only a small amount because we were the new kid on the block. I didn't want to look too greedy. So yeah, we could potentially continue this process.
Well, good. Sounds like it's ever forward then, moving in the right direction. Gary.
Council's edification, this was $20,000 that we had in the FY 2014 budget that council made available in 2015. There's an additional $10,000 in the FY 2015 budget. When this first came before council, the decision was made to have it administered through administration. Elisa's doing that. $5,000 that we indicated at that time bring projects to you, and this is kind of a catch-all, if you will. The project for the $5,000 appraisal or assessment
study
survey is one that Nels has indicated that he needs in order to continue his work with IHFA. The $350,000 grant is a reimbursement grant, so don't actually have cash up front to do these projects. So my discussions with Nils, the objective is to, as something comes up, he will bring in his proposal or what he intends to do to Elisa. Elisa will then review it and do a pay voucher. We'll get that money to him. Now that money will be used for the project, be reimbursed by IHFA, and that money is intended then to stay with the Chodo, so it does not come back to the city. So just so we understand the process.
So I have an initial cash flow problem just to kind of make this work, and
that's what we're here for.
And you're helping with the cash flow.
And Nils also shared with me is they want you to cash flow the rehab of the home, that 10 to 15% rehab, and that will help him with paying some of the contractors and things during that time while he waits to be reimbursed back from IHA.
Basically, all we have to do is capitalize the project, and then we get reimbursed.
Sounds like a noble cause, so hopefully we'll get some things done. Here it is.
I like these meetings. Can I come again next week?
Yes.
It looks like it.
It's his first check.
That's the first check, so
Congratulations.
good luck with that.
All right, not all at
Thank
once.
you.
I won't spend it all at once.
All right, next up is a report on the Public Art Master Plan with Becky Couch and Kathleen Burns. We're moving a lot quicker than the last committee, aren't we?
guys were
Gary, did
I
you-
think it has to do with leadership mostly, Dan.
You're not stretching it out for
It's either that or somebody's hungry. It's getting on dinner time.
It's the bottom, it's the,
Don't do it often enough these days.
There we go.
Thanks.
Good job.
I tell you what it is, but I couldn't read it without my glasses.
All right, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So Kathleen and I were here in early February, gave you the initial report on the public art master planning effort, and so we're here today just to give an update on what we've done and our next steps coming up. So just a quick recap, this was a goal of the Arts Commission. That's why we're working on this, and the plan is intended to establish goals and objectives that will articulate a 10-year community vision for public art within the city. Prior to development of a draft plan, we received public input through multiple years of the citizen survey and culture cafe sessions that were held by the Public Art Committee. Since February, we've completed a draft document. Within the document, there are 4 goals, which are followed by a number of objectives that will achieve the goals, and I just want to run through those quickly. The first is to increase public awareness and appreciation of public art. The second is to increase number of public art installations within the city. Third is to increase funding for installation and care of public art within the city. And fourth is to increase integrated art projects that are fully incorporated into the design of larger city projects. A public open house was held on March 5th, and the main goal of that open house was to seek input from the public on areas that they wanted to prioritize for art installations. There was a presentation of boards that basically gave a summary of all the content within the draft document, so people were able to review the goals, the objectives, the vision, and all of that information. And then in addition, we had 2 boards with maps on them for them to give us their public input. The first was the full city map, and participants were instructed, they were given 5 red dot stickers. They were instructed to place their 5 stickers on their 5 priority areas for where they'd like to see art. So this first map excluded the downtown area, and it listed 37 specific sites, so they could either put their dot on those sites that we provided, or they could put it in any location that they'd like to see art. And the sites included parks, city and public facilities, schools.
Libraries.
Yep, pathways, and city entrances. And then the second map was just highlighting the downtown area, including Legacy Crossing area, and again listed a few specific sites, and then also listed what we're calling collective projects, which are projects that could be located anywhere in the city. So those include bike racks, bus stops, utility box art, manhole covers, and then downtown streetscapes, which include benches, bike racks, planters, things like that. So you can see the downtown streetscape was highly popular, as well as the North City entry at the couplet of Main and C Street. So we compiled, initially we took the input from the citizen survey and the culture cafe sessions and kind of developed 4 focus areas where we'd like to see art. So those are downtown and Legacy Crossing, city entrances, parks and pathways, and then city and public facilities. And so within each of those 4 areas, we will have a number of project sites. And then specifically, we will list 10 prioritized project sites within the plan that will be intended to be completed within the next 10 years. So those are based on the input that we received. And I'll just go through those. The first one was the North City entry, the couplet at Main and C Street. The second was downtown streetscapes. The third was the Jackson and 6th Street corner of Legacy Crossing Zone. The South City entry at where US 95 crosses the South Fork of the Palouse River. The Public Library, Bourbon Creekside Park, East City Park, 1912 Center, Paradise Path, and then Friendship Square.
Now, these, I think what you're doing here is great. I think getting this information out and getting information back and letting people within the community know that you've got a plan and that you're moving ahead with it is, I think it's extraordinary. I think it's really good. And what it does is it prevents us from having to answer questions, which is even better.
Sure.
But my question is on the spots that you just noted. That is a conglomeration of all of the information that you got, plus the information from the Arts Committee itself?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep, all along we've been, did you want to chime in, or?
Yeah, the Public Arts Subcommittee of the Moscow Arts Commission, we went through a training for hosting cultural cafes through Karen Bubb in Boise, and then we took the training and went out to the community and did culture cafes on public art. We held several in this room. We also went to the Bloom Restaurant, and we had one, and then we also had one at the Farmers Market, and then we did consistent citizen survey questions regarding public art. So the Moscow Arts Commission for several years now has been cataloging. Thank you, Dan. Cataloging citizen comments and locations, and so, and then Becky's been doing a really good job putting the plan together, and then we've done our more dots with Linda Paul art opening. So, yep.
More questions we don't need to answer.
Yeah.
This is where you wanted it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's essentially.
This is what you said, yeah. Yep.
So then just our next steps is just to finalize the plan. It's going to include a capital improvement plan, and then we intend to circulate that for public input for the whole month of April. So we anticipate bringing it back to council for review and adoption during the month of May.
So, we say public art master plan, but honestly, explain to me what this is more than just sculpture. Well, it seems to me that, that's what we're looking at with this part of public art is public sculptures, because we're looking at installations and things like that. So what else would it be? I mean,
It could be, I'll give you a good example.
Okay.
It could be a memorial.
Oh, okay.
It could be a dedicated piece to something historical about Moscow. It could be murals.
Okay, yeah.
It could be integration in pavement. We do a lot of sidewalks. We could have markers on historical spaces in town, the history walk. It could involve a lot of different things.
Yeah, because I just wanted to make sure that, we weren't limiting ourselves to,
No.
just
Nope.
these things. There's more to art than just sculpture, but I wanted to make sure that we did.
That's correct, Dan.
I've been in this commission for a while.
He has.
I've
Dan's
learned all
been hitting
kinds
it
of
hard.
things.
Dan's been hitting it hard. And just in a reflection, I met with Jenny Ford today with Transit Center, and we talked about the sculptures out in front. And this year, they don't have that level of sculpture class, so now we're going to be doing a call for artists to the community for sculpture for those 4 places in front of the Transit Center, and hopefully have them unveiled during Art Walk.
Cool.
So that's one little component over there that we forget. The other thing about public art is all the tree grates are in on College Street now. That is the lentil design, and then some of the new manhole covers. So some of the public art has been integrated into
3-foot-high manhole covers.
no, but they've been integrated into infrastructure. So that's been happening as well, quietly.
That's right.
Yeah.
Sometimes people notice stuff from there.
So now
Shuffling
Jenny's going to put all the photographs of all the bus shelters on the Transit Center on their website, because people are constantly asking her. We've had callbacks from artists and said, where is my bus shelter? I need to tell my family that's coming to town. So we're going to list all those bus shelters with all the artists. So it's the little things that count.
Good. Anything
Yeah.
else? Guys?
Well done.
We'll look forward to seeing this in May.
Okay.
Thank you. Gary, we got anything else for the good of the order?
No, sir, we are ready to go.
All right, we'll consider ourselves adjourned. Let's get out of here.